Hello, everyone. Hello, Sophie. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Eve. Hi, Sebastian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so great to have you with us, Sophie. Every time I look into Switzerland, I am just blown away with what you're doing there. It feels like you're always not one step ahead, but several steps ahead of many other countries. So having you here to shed some light, I would say mostly about the CO2 transportation infrastructure, but probably many other topics around it as well. I'm just super excited to get started. Um, Maybe as a scene setter, it might be just great to get like a very quick take on like what are the key climate targets for Switzerland and how does removal fit in to kind of set the scene and set the background for the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So we have a very clear government and political vision with regard to CDR and how it fits into the Swiss net zero target. So we have a binding net zero target, which was also confirmed by by popular vote. And this is enshrined in a new Climate and Innovation Framework Act. And it also includes interesting other elements like a net zero target for Swiss companies by 2050 and a net zero target for the Swiss administration by 2040 for scope 1, 2, and even 3. And negative emission technologies, or CDR, are also legally defined as technologies which durably store CO2. And these net zero targets are also defined as something which has to be achieved by reducing to the max and then balancing with CDR any residual emissions. So that's our framework. Legally binding. We know CDR will have to play a role. And then in strategic documents, we also, the Swiss government advocates for a stepwise approach to really start on early learning with small projects, sometimes symbolic projects, prototyping, maybe one could even say, but with a clear vision to scale as quickly as possible. And we are currently in what we call the pioneering phase up to 2030. And from 2030 on up to 2050, we really want to have a legal framework in place which tries to solve as much of the investment barriers we have today as possible. So that also includes any technical regulation relevant for CO2 transport, namely pipeline, but also the big question around financing of the whole carbon removal aspect, but also the CCS value chains, where CDR really feeds in a very significant manner, because we currently assume that a good portion of the CO2 that we will be capturing at point sources in Switzerland will be biogenic, in the order of close to 30% by 2050. So the solutions, the long-term solutions for transport and also storage, are absolutely very relevant for for making use of the Swiss CDR domestic potential that we hope to be able to leverage.
And one thing that kind of stands out is also that the targets are pretty high from kind of an outsider's perspective. Like if I am correct, you CCS, I think is 12 megatons by 2050, roughly, and right now you have around 40 megatons of total emissions in Switzerland, right? So for me, that what stands out as well is that you're planning to rely to a large extent on CCS in your net zero target. So yeah, can you maybe, how did this come about? Because I know that in some countries, yeah, the CCS plays a smaller role than in Switzerland.
Well, it's always relative. If it's big or small, you always have to be careful which numbers are actually included. But yeah, so currently it's plus minus 40 megatons of CO2 equivalents, which we are emitting. I don't have the newest numbers on my mind. Sorry about that. But in our long-term strategy, for instance, we also included international aviation in this picture, because international aviation is also included in our long-term net zero target by 2050. And we also have a more recent estimation on how much CDR would possibly also be needed for aviation. So when it comes to CCS and CDR in the long run and its relative share to current emissions, I think industrial emissions, we expect to have about 5 million tons by 2050. So fossil and process emissions. So process emissions from cement production, fossil emissions mainly from burning fossil waste and waste incineration plants. And this would all be addressed with CCS, and what cannot be captured would be addressed with CDR. And there we are in the order of 2 megatons for bioenergy CCS, which would basically come from the same point sources where we also do CCS to reduce emissions. So maybe special in Switzerland, we have close to 30 waste incineration plants, where half of the CO2 emitted is biogenic, and we have 6 cement plants, and if I'm not mistaken, all of them have a share of biomass, which they burn as well. So every CCS installation you put at a large point source in Switzerland, or almost everyone, will also have a CDR component. So it would be 2 million tons of biogenic bioenergy CCS, and then we believe, as of now, there's not much potential left in Switzerland. So the residual amount of CDR that we would require, we would have to purchase from abroad in line with Paris Agreement rules. So Article 6.2 or 6.4 in the Paris Agreement, and as things currently stand, that would be about 6 to 7 million tons of additional CDR abroad.
These are massive numbers, I think, if we look at Switzerland as a country. But it's so great to see that the homework has been done, right? You have these numbers already in front of you, and you can start planning for actually achieving those numbers. Now, for the first time, I became aware of the considerations in Switzerland around the waste to energy and capturing CO2 and finding ways to transport the CO2 for storage. And to a large extent, the focus there was to look where to store it outside Switzerland. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. So it has been a really, really long process. And I mean, these kind of studies were happening when other countries were really not even realizing the role of CDR that much. And you were already looking at, okay, how much are we going to capture, from where, how are we going to transport it, and like, what does it actually mean in practice? And oftentimes the conversation around carbon management focuses mostly on capture, and then people also think of storage. But the transport side, this whole infrastructure that we need to have in place to actually move the CO2 around, somehow doesn't get as much attention, or seems to be kind of the last one that gets the attention, which is in a way crazy, because to have like a fully operational value chain, you need to have all 3 parts. It's not enough if you have all the incentives for capture and storage. You also need to have the transportation network to actually move that CO2 around. And cross-border is a huge topic for Switzerland. So other countries will have, for sure, a lot to learn from you on how you approach this. Maybe you can share a bit of your considerations, because I know you've been looking at, okay, what does it mean to transport it towards the North Sea, or rather towards the north, or is there a way also towards the south? How does a country start approaching this question? Because many countries will not have their own storage, or if they have some onshore, they might not have enough. So it's such a important topic to dig into.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about your observations with regards to what what governments, or also the public, or also the CDR community has focused on so far. And I feel like I've observed a similar thing also when speaking to to stakeholders, or also other policymakers. And yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your views on what you think, why this is. But just as an example, I was in a CDR workshop where we were looking at how to improve framework conditions for CDR in Switzerland. And during preparations, the the organizers told me they absolutely do not want to talk about CO2 transport and storage, and I tried to explain them that in our view, according to our best guesses and estimates, that the hugest share of CDR potential would be based on bioenergy CCS, and there would have to be solutions for transport and storage as well. So I don't know where it comes from. If maybe some people just don't find it very technical, you know. I mean, there are so many technical questions coming up around these pipelines and how the CO2 is transported, and completely different characteristics on physical characteristics also compared to hydrogen or methane. So I think what was really useful for the Swiss approach was that really early on, we tried to have a holistic approach with regards to CCS and CDR and all the challenges that come with it. So we tried to have a good first guess of estimate or of where we're heading towards in 2050. So I have mentioned these numbers before, and then trying to move backward on trying to understand what would be necessary to reach interim targets, and then or kind of then with this backward thinking, then trying to design a scale-up path and to understand what would have to be the first steps to get moving, because the challenge just seems so enormous when you look at what has to be there in 2050 that I think this approach really helped. I don't know if sometimes it's useful to be a small country as well, because we have very close dialogues and coordination with other administrations, like the Office for Energy, for instance, which is competent and responsible for regulating the gas grids or also electricity grids and hydrogen, etc. And we also very closely engaged with Swiss stakeholders, be it emitters or the gas sector, or also academia, which are working on pilot projects, and they regularly tell us where their issues are, and one issue which came up from the very beginning is always, you know, we need solutions for CO2 transport, be it short-term solutions and then a pipeline in the future, and of course we also need a solution for the business case, which always pushed us in thinking about all these issues kind of at the same time and trying to move them forward in parallel. So what's your view? Why do you think that that transport, etc., has not been so much in the focus? But sorry, Sebastian, go ahead.
No, on that question, I'll hand it right to Eve. I was going to take it a different direction, so I'm sure that in your role at ZEP as well, you had a lot of these interactions.
Yeah, and right now ZEP is working a lot, obviously, because of the upcoming CO2 market and infrastructure package. I think why this has gotten less attention is, first of all, we haven't had in the EU level specific policy proposals on the table on this. This is basically the last big one coming, right? We have plenty of rules on the capture side. We have now Net Zero Industry Act focusing on storage. I mean, yes, there's the CCS directive as well historically, but that is in itself didn't make CCS happen. And it just has been the last piece in the puzzle. But essentially, the CO2 Transportation Network is kind of a hidden plumbing behind the whole system, because you can capture, whether for CCS or CDR, but you can never get to any scale or behind pilots unless you have that infrastructure connecting you to storage. And as Sophie said, we are expecting large volumes coming from BECCS projects, for example, or in the EU policy speak bio-CCS projects. So it's just, I think it hasn't gotten that much attention. It's also very, very technical. As soon as you get into under even the first layer. So it's tricky. And the most difficult situation is that we have already projects that are being built whilst the rules have not yet been established. So now we have to figure out how to make it all work in a harmonized way. it's very tricky, but it's hugely important, especially if you look at the volumes that you expect to move. By the way, Sophie, do you know in terms of volumes, like how much CO2 you expect to kind of go through Switzerland, like for cross-border transportation?
So we have a two-pillar approach. So we try to store as much as possible in Switzerland and export as necessary, but we really do not know if we ever will have geological storage which can be operational. So it's not at all, it's not forbidden. And we're also working on legislation so that by 2031 it's very clear how things work for planning, for building and operating, and also closing CO2 storage underground in Switzerland, and also the same regulations for pipelines, so that element at least is is cleared. So yeah, we really do not know, and theoretically, there where the geological potential is there where the majority of the Swiss population lives. So we're very densely populated between Geneva and Zurich, more or less, and we're trying to assess the potential and feasibility also with an injection study we plan to do in the canton of Zurich together with the Technical University of Zurich. And so far, very interestedly, responses have been plus minus neutral. I mean, people are interested, but there's no strong backlash as of now. So that's positive, and we will continue to pursue that. But at the same time, the worst case scenario will be that we will have to export everything for storage to the north or to the south. So we're talking about these 7 million tons of CO2 by 2050 per year of mixed CO2.
Been there because first I just wanted to applaud you on kind of this holistic way of approaching CCS and CDR, because what I'm seeing, for example, in Germany where I work a lot, they're even going to be managing completely different ministries, not just like different teams, but different ministries, and that creates so much confusion. And so I applaud you for that. But also taking the German example, I always come back to this kind of domestic versus export, and I want to understand. I'm not as deep in it, so I would love to understand the rationale, because when I look at Switzerland, when I look at Germany, there is domestic storage. It's just not yet developed, and it's not very appealing to many people, right? But in theory, it could be developed. But in Germany as well, the intuition is kind of we're going to export it, Denmark, Norway, and we're going to build the infrastructure primarily for export versus domestic storage. So I'm wondering, what are the arguments kind of that you're weighing up when you're thinking about prioritizing infrastructure for export versus infrastructure domestically when it comes to this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And we also closely follow, of course, what happens in Germany, where also how this differs from the perception in Austria, for instance, where, as I understand, they they opened up legislation to allow for onshore storage. I think what is interesting in Switzerland is that several voices also say, no, we shouldn't export. We should actually take responsibility and predominantly store domestically. And this is just my personal guess. This may also have to do with the fact that we've had a very long process and also public debate on on how to deal with our radioactive waste. And we have had a very long process where we looked for storage sites over decades, I believe, and now and there's always been processes to also have a local participation from from the general public, etc. And we are now at a point where, on basis of best scientific knowledge, a storage site has been defined, one single one, and it's generally accepted by the population. Also, this notion of having to take care of your own waste. Yeah, and regarding the waste topic, I personally think that with regards to regulating these transport, namely regulating also the market, I think this is an important and also very very new element, and I'd also be interested to see how this will be tackled in the EU, because in essence, let's assume you're transporting CO2 to, in the majority, store it durably. Some may be used for CCU and in short-lived products, etc., but a lot will be stored durably. And it does have more the characteristics of a waste disposal service, no, in comparison to a commodity market. So yeah, we don't have any final solution on that yet, but I think it's an important element to be considered when regulating such markets.
Yeah. So in Switzerland, currently, you don't have yet the federal law on the CO2 infrastructure, right? That's something that is currently in the works. And it looks like the timeline for when the proposal comes out in the EU and when you will have something coming out in Switzerland is kind of aligned. It's next summer. But because you are currently in this pioneering phase in Switzerland, right? It's more about piloting, and then from 2030 onwards, you're gonna be doing a scaling up phase. And this federal law is actually tackling the time, I think, after 2030, if I'm understanding correctly. So what does it mean for what is happening now before 2030 and for piloting? Like, what are you building now and what are the project developers using now today?
So there are transport opportunities already now for smaller volumes, and it matches well because as of now we all have small capture volumes. There's been a demonstration, a pilot where Swiss CO2 has been transported to Iceland by truck, train, and ship. That could be demonstrated. We have projects in the pipeline which are fully financed up to 2030 by a Swiss foundation, which plan to further export to Iceland, but also to Denmark. And there, the involved actors could recently announce that they could conclude a commercial contract with Greensand. It's still just a few thousand tons per year, but it's opening up the pathways potentially and hopefully for more. And as I understand, this transport will mainly happen by train. And we discussed also with the responsible office for for train transport to get an estimate on how much capacity we'd have by rail. And this is really just a first guess, but it could be in the order of 1 million tons of CO2 by train annually. So that is enough for first industrial scale projects as well, which is good news. And then we recently also a study was conducted for the area of Basel, where they were looking at the emitters and potential pooling approaches and various transport modes. And that was a new insight for me. They also specifically look at transport by barge via the Rhine. And there potentially an additional 1 million tons of CO2 could be transported per year. Always subject to having the business cases in place, so all the investments would be done also into new ships, etc. But so there are opportunities in place, and these are all more or less going towards the north. Potentially also routes would open up towards the south, and especially for large emitters which are considering to be first movers, as I understand, they're really all planning for train transport as of now. Considering maybe to switch to a pipeline at a later stage when it's there, but the pipeline is still so uncertain. I mean, not only in Switzerland, because we still need this legal framework for regulation, but also for the financing part. But we also rely on connections by neighboring states, right? And they have to be there in place and time, and we have to make sure that legally the connection is possible with regards to international regulation, and then the commercial actors have to find each other and agree on all the technicalities. So a lot of elements which have to fall into place, and it's good to know that at least for the short term or for the first larger projects, we do have other options than pipelines.
Both of you, is there actually a significant difference in both risk profile and cost of pipeline versus ship, train, truck? Like, I would imagine that transporting by pipeline should be safer than by truck, for example, but I don't no. So are there big differences between pipeline versus other means?
I don't know about safety, but pipelines are, the cheapest, obviously. But in the end, the most expensive, what makes CO2 transport the most expensive is the distance. The more you have to transport, the more expensive it gets. Right? That's the most important element to bear in mind. But the most tricky thing about the transportation network, which I think is something that is often not realized by those who are just focusing on the capture side of things, is that to build a transportation network, especially if we talk about pipelines, you have to have everything happen at the same time. All the different sources will have to come online so that they feed the right amount of CO2 into the pipelines, so that the storage sites get the guaranteed amount of CO2 coming in. It all has to be done according to the same technical specs. So it's actually a very, very complex exercise to make it work. And then, it's in Europe, largely these networks are going to be cross-border. So it all has to match and work out. It's an extremely complex exercise. It kind of feels like happening in the background because it doesn't get as much attention as the capture and storage. But without this, the rest doesn't really matter. So it's so important that we get it right. What I'm curious to know, actually, is feel free to also respond to Sebastian, but I'm curious to know from you, what are, what you can share, of course, are there some key sticky points you're still trying to figure out in Switzerland when it comes to CO2 transportation and the upcoming legislation? And what are you expecting, or what are your asks for the EU as they are figuring out their own rules for CO2 transportation?
Mm. So we had some very Swiss specific but important, very basic questions or sticky points, which were: can we regulate at a national level at all? Does the Swiss constitution allow for that? So we've had many discussions with with the Justice Department on this, and fortunately at this stage the answer is yes, or at least to a certain degree at national level. So that's good. But then again, there's always the question: do we really want this, or is this necessary? So a lot of discussions or questions also around whether how much responsibility do you leave with the next governance level, with the cantons, and how much do you actually do at national level. So that's an important thing. And then there are the planning element is very, very relevant. So as I understand, also in the EU, they're considering these questions as well. How much centralized planning or also government-led planning do you want to consider? Questions around market regulation, and in particular around not over-regulating the whole thing when you're still building up the market. How much flexibility you want to leave to it, but also manage the risks of leaving too much flexibility and having potential market abuse. I think that's hard, particularly since it's the first time also this kind of infrastructure is built, and it's not built for a commodity market in principle. Then also issues around synergies with other new infrastructure, like hydrogen grids, for instance. How much should this be coordinated or shouldn't? And also in practical terms, if you really start building, you rather just rip up the street once, to put a pipeline for CO2 and potentially also hydrogen. And what is very important for us with regards to cross-border transport is that we can really closely coordinate or somehow also be part of the planning of a grid within Europe, because I mean, we have a linked emission trading system. I mean, we are partners in the quest of decarbonizing the industrial sectors, and you can only reduce with conventional measures to a certain degree. We all know these industries will need CCS, and they have this biogenic potential to generate removals. So it's important that that also Swiss emitters have the opportunity to make use of transport and storage solutions, which are also available to their ETS counterparts in Europe. I think that's a central element.
Very insightful, but I think we are at time. So, Sebastian, something very quick at the end, or shall we wrap up?
I think we should wrap up. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. This is definitely going to be super interesting to hear also for many other policymakers who are trying to get up to speed on this topic in their respective countries. And I know governments also are talking to each other plenty on this topic. But thanks for doing the great work in Switzerland, leading by example. Really hope that it all works out great when it comes to making the transportation infrastructure as compatible as possible across all the borders in Europe. So thanks again so much, and looking forward to future conversations.
Well, thank you, Eve. And also thanks for all your work at ZEP. I read everything. It's very useful. Also a lot of hard thinking on your side and the team as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.